Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for Friday, August 10th. Since 1990, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed commentary on the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and now by way of the good folks at Urbana Public Television and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program can be found at archive.org. Our name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who says that in the U.S. media, either to repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things. This is an I Have a Little List edition of News from Neptune. Apologies to Gilbert and Sullivan fans, like our former colleague Ron Zoke, whose birthday was Hiroshima Day. There's a film from about 15 years ago about the atom bombing of Hiroshima. The title of the film comes from Thomas Merton's poem of the same name, Original Child Bomb. The phrase original child bomb was derived from the Japanese term for the atom bomb, Genshi Bakudan. Genshi, which means atom, contains root characters which, when rendered individually, can be taken to mean original and child. It's a bilingual pun, or probably more likely a bilingual mistranslation. We'll each begin tonight with a list of topics or questions from the week's news. Here's mine. 1. Despite the hype around Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib is to become the first Muslim woman and Palestinian American elected to Congress. Rashida Tlaib, 42, won this week's Democratic primary in Michigan's 13th congressional district, defeating 5 other candidates and poised to become the first Muslim woman and the first Palestinian American in Congress. She'll run in November unopposed, as there is no Republican or third-party candidate vying in the race. 2, there's an interesting interview with Norman Finkelstein on the work of on the role of the Holocaust in the consciousness of Jews, American Jews of his generation, well, actually others as well. Finkelstein is in his mid-60s, and how the allegations of anti-Semitism are being falsely used in the British Labour Party. The claim of anti-Semitism seems to be the main line of attack against Corbyn, Jeremy Corbyn, remarkably enough, and the left of the Labour Party. 3, you might compare it, by the way, to Russiagate in this country, but obviously other things are at work. Point 3, the U.S. responsibility for the killing of kids in Yemen this week, a Saudi bombing of a school bus, is shocking enough, and it should be enough to begin thinking about the U.S. Stopping supporting the KSA murderers. 4, new sanctions on Russia by the U.S., supposedly in response to the Skripal affair. Russia is to treat further U.S. sanctions as an open declaration of economic war, according to the Russian Prime Minister. His name is Medvedev, by the way, not Putin. The U.S. accuses Russia of using chemical or biological weapons against the Skripals, this father-daughter combination in Salisbury, England. The event didn't happen in the U.S., didn't happen to Americans. The U.S. imposes sanctions on Russia on this basis, the Skripal poisonings of March 2018. What could be a more transparent excuse? 5, a war zone complicates the Ebola vaccine rollout in the latest outbreak. Health workers must plan vaccination effort amidst fighting in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the U.S. is responsible, at least in part, for the continuation of that fighting. These are the things that our government should be dealing with. 6, Ottawa's criticism of a crackdown on dissidents has prompted Saudi Arabia to freeze its Canadian ties, and a Kingdom-linked Saudi Arabian-linked Twitter account to even threaten a 9/11 style attack. This is amazing. Riyadh's behavior, that is South, let's try that again. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's behavior is a reminder that its claims of reform are a sham. It was waging a devastating war in Yemen, which fuels the world's largest outbreak of cholera, and it has now added Canada to its foes. The Saudi Arabia expelled the Canadian ambassador, and it's freezing all trade with Canada. Let's remember, it's Saudi Arabia here that the American president clasped an orb with. You can't make this stuff up. 7, the economy is not doing well for Americans, but you won't hear the elites and mainstream media talk about this. The Wall Street Journal wrote this week, the rate of older people filing for bankruptcy in the U.S. has surged since 1991. 8, why are we choosing to let people be homeless rather than spend our money to guarantee a home for everyone? Wall Street Journal also reported this week it's the new form of affordable housing. More homeless people are living in cars than ever before in the United States. 9. Various commentators on Assange's future, Julian Assange's future, and whether they think it's in Assange's interest to testify to the U.S. Senate as he is apparently invited to. Likely to be a one-sided lecture, witch hunt over trying to trap Assange in some way, or put him in jail already, perhaps get him to give up his rights as a publisher to published leaked materials. 10, the Assange case is particularly outrageous because of the lying attacks on Julian Assange and WikiLeaks from the supposed liberals in Congress, such as our own senior Senator Durbin. No more parties are getting involved in pressuring others to censor their forums, a tie-in to the ongoing WikiLeaks Assange story. 11, Obama, who expanded worldwide drone assassinations 10 times, oversaw the destruction of Libya, Syria, Yemen, the creation of ISIS, and the African refugee crisis, and who prosecuted more whistleblowers using the Espionage Act than all previous presidents combined, received a Human Rights Award this week. 12, censorship is big in the news. The mainstream media won't cover, so note what's going on with that set of stories. Now, not only will Tom Dispatch, a blog that turns up in various places, be blocked by the U.S. military, that is, if you're using the Defense Department connections and you're a member of the military, to read the internet, you will not be allowed to see Tom's Dispatch. It's considered inappropriate. This as goes on while InfoWars is being blocked by Google, Apple, and Twitter, in which what appears to be a coordinated censorship. I had one more, and I forget what it was. That's a real dozen, not a baker's dozen.
Okay. Well, this is going to be a little more random than yours, perhaps.
Is that possible?
I don't know. We'll see. But I'm just going to do it in order, even though I've got things kind of mixed up. I don't want to be flipping back and forth. So a good start to this would be the anniversary, the second anniversary of the murder of Michael Brown. A very good analysis of this on the Jacobin website, in which the authors write, Brown's death dramatized stark inequalities as the U.S. Department of Justice and local activists and organizations pulled back the veil on policing in Ferguson in St. Louis County. Other conspirators emerged. One was fragmented local government, the very fact that a tiny jurisdiction like Ferguson claimed the authority to police Michael Brown at all. Another was the ongoing fiscal crisis in local government, driven by the desire to exercise home rule, absent the capacity to pay for it. in this larger context, the confrontation on August 9, 2014, I'm sorry, that would be fourth anniversary, not second, was as unsurprising as it was tragic. And some really interesting data. I know we're talking about the life and death, but some of the economic and governmental funding data that they bring to forth in this article on Jacobin is very revealing. Noam Chomsky coming under fire for promoting Nicaragua, not the overthrow of Daniel Ortega, but the sort of propagating the narrative that this corrupt government, the people who voted for him need to vote again, according to our mentor, and that's caused a lot of consternation from various quarters. Similarly, why the U.S. silence over the Saudi Arabian Al-Qaeda alliance regarding Yemen, just to reassert your own points. Yeah. In a couple of interviews on The Real News with a fellow named Ali Al-Ahmed, in one of these interviews, they played a clip of a woman named Catherine Zimmerman of the American Enterprise Institute, who said, you were talking about the American Enterprise Institute here, don't forget, within the Yemeni civil war, American interests and Al-Qaeda interests align. The Al-Houthis are a common enemy or adversary, especially in the American case. It doesn't make sense that the United States has identified Al-Qaeda as a threat, but that we have common interests inside of Yemen, and that in some places it looks like we're looking the other way. In other words, this makes sense to the neoconservative analyst at the AEI that we look the other way. The comment by Ali Al-Ahmed, a perceptive observer of Yemen and the context of Yemen, including the economic and oil context of Yemen, which isn't spoken about enough, I don't think. He says the U.S. is not looking the other way. We don't like them because they want to be independent. That is, the Houthis want to be independent of the United States. U.S. support for terrorism in the Middle East began with the Obama administration. And so, it's even more outrageous than looking the other way. He notes that it's striking to see the silence in the U.S. regarding American support for the Saudi assault on Yemen, sort of quasi-genocidal. Let's see here. A couple of comments on a New York Times Magazine lengthy article called by Nathaniel Rich, who happens to be the son of Frank Rich, the esteemed former New York Times columnist and, of course, theater critic. Nathaniel Rich wrote a long piece called Losing Earth, which talks about the era from 1979 to 1989, how we missed the opportunities, how opportunities were missed at that time during the Reagan era to address climate change when it was first being understood. A comment by my close friend, Louis Project.
Oh, yeah. Louis back in town.
Since the article, I should give him his due once in a while.
Right.
Since the article is personality-driven, you don't get any sense of the institutional and social pressures that led to action not being taken. Indeed, you might even draw the conclusion that if Sununu, that is one of George H.W. Bush's aides, had been more enlightened, the planet would be in better shape today. Discounting the notion that it's really John Sununu or any other individual's fault that this wasn't addressed. A comment by a more well-known climate science person, Naomi Klein, who said, when I looked, after reading this article and in response to this article, when I looked at the same period, what was the name of her book? Anyway, she wrote a whole book about it. I forgot the exact title. When I looked at the same period, I came to a very different conclusion, that what at first seemed like our best shot at life-saving climate action had in retrospect suffered from an epic case of historical bad timing. Because what becomes clear when you look back at this juncture is that just as governments were getting together to get serious about reining in the fossil fuel sector, the global neoliberal revolution went supernova, and that project of economic and social re-engineering clashed with the imperatives of both climate science and corporate regulation at every turn, Naomi Klein says. And she concludes, the failure to make even a passing reference to this other global trend that was unfolding in the late 80s represents an unfathomably large blind spot in Rich's piece. Although I haven't read this particular piece, but I'm sure it's informative at many levels. Another New York Times Magazine piece that's extremely informative, but of course has a blind spot, War Without End by C.J. Chivers, about which is the summarized, the blurb at the top says, the Pentagon's failed campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan left a generation of soldiers with little to fight for, but one another. And the story, which is well worth reading, discusses the journeys of two people into the U.S. military service, one of whom survived, one of whom was killed, in the context of their dealing with patrolling obscure, what to Americans are obscure regions of Afghanistan. Again, but still needs to be said, and sort of telling the story of the fact that the leaders, American leaders and American military strategists and the American military, even the central command on the ground in Afghanistan, is out of touch with what the reality in the Afghan hinterlands is, what they're trying to control with these patrols that these two individuals were involved in. Back about 10 years ago, 2008, 2009, when Obama kind of got the Afghan war going again to a certain extent. But again, not pointing out really the larger context of what we're doing there in the first place, what got us there, who might have opposed those things, all that stuff that was going on from 2001 to 2003 as we entered Afghanistan and Iraq. The blurb refers to Iraq. The article, as far as I recall, only included the tours of duty of these individuals in Afghanistan. Here's a comment back to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a comment from another Palestinian, other than the woman that you referred to, who's about to be elected to Congress, right. Stephen Salida, of American of Palestinian background. And he, in relation to criticism of AOC, in terms of the comments that she has made or not made in response to questions about Palestine subsequent to her victory, Salida's pithy, sarcastic comment is worth noting here just for fun. How about this? Maybe the Israeli state can give Palestinians a break. This is in response to people asking for the left to give AOC a break in terms of her comments about Palestine. Salida moves on. Maybe the Zionists pressuring Ocasio-Cortez into compliance with settler colonization can give her a break too. Nah, it's always critique from the left that needs to stop, isn't it? Stephen Salida asks in a sarcastic tone, but the point he's making is, there's an ongoing debate on the left about give her a chance, and certainly she should be given a chance, but that doesn't mean that she shouldn't be pressured by people with points of view that feel that her alleged radicalism kind of began to fade the moment that she won. Here's an unrelated, although everything's related, an unrelated headline, I think from the New York Times. Just give you the headline here. For many college students, hunger can make it hard to focus in class. Talking about hunger among college students kind of speaks for itself in our neoliberal era. And then a related here, I guess related to that, this is the same. I'm sorry, this was an article that was on naked capitalism, posted by, written by a woman named Michelle Andrews, health policy reporter, columnist for Kaiser Health News. As students enter college this fall, many will hunger for more than knowledge. Up to half of college students report that they were either not getting enough to eat or were worried about it, according to published studies. Food insecurity, as it's called, is most prevalent at community colleges, but it's common at public and private four-year schools as well. Student activists and advocates in the education community have drawn attention to the problem in recent years, and the food pantries that have sprung up at hundreds of schools are perhaps the most visible sign. Some schools are using the Swipe Out Hunger program, which allows students to donate their unused meal plan vouchers or swipes to other students to use at campus dining halls or food pantries. That's my little list.
That's what happens when we try little lists, right? We both come up with a number of things that keep us would take half the program and come up with a number of any one of which could take us through the rest of the program. Yeah. Actually, I would like to pick up one that is just faintly in-house, as you suggested, and that is the rather surprising series of attacks ostensibly from the left on Noam Chomsky in the last week and two. I think this is important because we're talking not only about the reputation, if that's quite the right word, of the man we take as our model and mentor for News from Neptune, that is Noam Chomsky, who will be 90 in December. It's not just that, but it's also because the question of Nicaragua has been bruited about in recent political commentary in this country in a way that I think misrepresents both what the U.S. is doing in trying to roll back the red tide in Latin America and the murderous activities that the CIA clearly is encouraging throughout the continent. The point has been that there has been a popular, in inverted commas, uprising against the government of President Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. Ortega is a descendant, political descendant of the Sandinista Revolution, which the U.S. did so much to try to crush with the Contra War. The appearance of Ortega as president was a result of a victory by the Sandinistas that was then modified, is too light a word, by American pressure, international and economic, and produced a government in Nicaragua, which did not represent the ideals of the Sandinista Revolution. It became a neoliberal government that was acceptable to the United States. But now the U.S. seems to be moiling about in troubled waters in Nicaragua, as it has done in so many other Latin American countries, and helped to produce the revolution or the contestation that's confronting the Ortega government. Leftists in this country have been quick to leap to the defense of Ortega and are appalled in some cases that Chomsky is less than charmed with the nature of Ortega's government. There's a problem here, and that's a problem of reporting and understanding that leads many people in the United States so to mistrust what mainstream media tell us about what the U.S. is doing abroad that they believe just the opposite. As my thesis director used to say in a very strange way, the closest thing to a concavity is a convexity. What he seemed to mean by that is if you say A is not the case, then saying not A must be the case is not necessarily true. So in any case, here's what Chomsky actually has said about Nicaragua and about the current unrest in Nicaragua, which has killed several hundred people. I mean, this is serious. Mm-hmm. He points out that in Nicaragua, under the tamed Sandinista government and its neoliberal successor, or predecessor, he says, well, first of all, there were plenty of problems in Nicaragua even in the 1980s, but by the standards of the region, it stood out as almost a stellar record. Bad, but by the standards of the region, much better. In 1990, the first President Bush essentially informed the population of Nicaragua that either you vote for our candidate, the U.S. candidate, or else the Contra War, the terrorist war, which the U.S. was carrying on against Nicaragua, it continues, and harsh sanctions will strangle the country. This is, once again, America's standard operating procedure from the U.S., particularly in Latin America. And indeed, at the point of a gun, says Chomsky, the population voted the Sandinistas out, and partially for internal reasons. There was real internal opposition against the Sandinistas. Nicaragua is not unified. And in 1990, the Sandinista government lost an election. There were many things that they were doing that they shouldn't have, said Chomsky. Since then, it hasn't been anywhere near as bad as the other Central American countries, the ones that are more or less overwhelmingly influenced by the U.S. But there's been a lot of corruption, a lot of repression. It's autocratic, undoubtedly. That is the post-Sandinista government of Nicaragua. The opposition is nothing to write home about either, for the most part. So it's by no means a pretty situation. One would hope that negotiations could reduce the tensions. My own view is that I think it would be a good thing for Nicaragua if Ortega, the president, were to call early elections and allow them to be run without corruption and brutality. It's hard to see a simple way out at this point. It's a very unfortunate situation. We should bear in mind, this is Chomsky again on Nicaragua, we should bear in mind that in the early 1980s, the situation was extremely hopeful in Nicaragua. Even the international institutions, like the World Bank and others, were praising the progressive steps being taken by the Sandinistas. What does praise from the World Bank really mean? But still, the country was full of hope, excitement, literacy campaigns, dealing with poverty. U.S. intervention actually began in the mid-19th century and had been horrible all the way through, but they were beginning to pull themselves out of it until the U.S. terrorist war began. We should bear in mind that the United States is the only country ever to have been condemned by the International Court of Justice for international terrorism against Nicaragua, technically unlawful use of force, and ordered to pay substantial reparations to Nicaragua for the attack that it was carrying out. Of course, the U.S. refused the World Court's jurisdiction. The World Court was condemned not only by the government, but even by the press. New York Times condemned it as a hostile forum because it had ruled against the United States, so of course you don't have to pay any attention to it. The U.S. even vetoed a Security Council resolution calling on states to observe international law, because international law included this judgment against the United States. So the United States is in the remarkable position of having its outrageous United Nations representative vetoing a resolution calling upon countries to observe international law. And then the Contra War went on, the sanctions went on, the other forms of subversion continued, and their hopes were pretty much smashed. you could just see the changes in expectation and attitudes. And one result was internal corruption, repression, and then it's now imploding. But again, it's a very ugly and unfortunate situation, nothing remotely comparable to the countries that have been under the U.S. thumb throughout the period. But going back, well, we could press on with that, but his point is that the government of Nicaragua, with the vicissitudes forced upon it by the United States, was no prize, but it was a far cry from the repressive governments that the U.S. wants to put in place. Ortega's government was a neoliberal government that was forced and willing to play ball with the United States' control of the region. That's what the U.S. insisted upon all along. And the opposition to that government has some real justification. But this is a far cry, it seems to me, from Noam Chomsky calling for the support of the Ortega government over against legitimate opposition to it. And that opposition will probably grow, and we'll hear more about it. I think it's rather strange and interesting that the defense of that opposition has centered on criticizing Chomsky for not being fully down with the program.
Yeah, and they put forward a kind of laundry list of accomplishments and successes in basic economic terms and educational terms of the Sandinista regime that returned to power, I think, in 2006, and then
Yes.
and has been reelected. Ortega been reelected twice since then, and one looks at that and says, well, this sounds really good. There is another side to that in terms of Ortega's authoritarianism that Chomsky refers to. We have to be careful about that. My views about this were first influenced by an interview that I mentioned a couple weeks ago that Doug Henwood did with a woman who he's relied on as an interlocutor about Nicaragua, a woman named Rebecca Gordon. And she gave, for what it's worth, if you listen to that interview, that 25-minute interview, you'll get a good background for the whole history of what's gone on there from the Contras forward. But she tended to come down on the side of things are really bad because the government is bad. And I think that since then I've listened to interviews by and reports from somebody who's on the ground there, I guess what's the word, omnipresent Max Blumenthal from Gaza, not from Gaza to Ferguson, but from Gaza to Managua, just doing incredible on-the-ground journalism on the Gray Zone Project, and also just on the podcast that his own podcast, Moderate Rebels, and on another podcast of his buddies on Unauthorized Disclosure. Really good interviews, good detailed interviews about what he's observing on the ground there, and he is not equivocal at all in seeing the rebels, the so-called rebels, as being basically fronts for American foreign policy, and that there's he finds no good in what they're doing, nothing legitimate that I could tell in other than to make trouble in ways similar to the analogy here, of course, is with Iran and with Syria and with other places where has been furious debate on the left, but even someone like Louis Project, who has been on the sort of the anti-Assadist side in Syria, is much more absolutely on the critical of the government first and foremost, finds similar to Max Blumenthal, who he would of course never compliment because he hates Max Blumenthal for his Syria views, But anyway, what Max is doing is what Lewis and Max are doing is putting the events in Nicaragua in the context, sort of the context about debate of Central America, about the idea that the Sandinistas could have done better, but this whole revolution in one country business is what the problem historically is that the left has always been dealing with. I mean, they planted this thing down in the middle of this American-controlled region, and they've been fighting with it ever since. And so you have to cut them some slack in regard to what they're dealing with.
There's a parallel here, I think. You mentioned Syria. What happened in Syria, and once again, this is pretty far from the accounts that we get from the United States and from mainstream media in this country. But what happened in Syria is that a popular revolution really did break out against the Assad government, the Damascus government, in 2011. There were roots for it in the peculiar political circumstances of Syria, but it was a revolution against a legitimate government that was non-ideological. It was secular. A legitimate secular government in Syria confronted an uprising that was part of the whole Arab Spring criticism of governments in the Middle East and North Africa that found roots in Syria in local problems. But what happened next was that the Damascus government, Assad's government, attempted to suppress or to counter this revolutionary movement was countered itself by the United States, by the Obama administration, which aided Saudi Arabia and Qatar to send jihadists, that is, radical Islamic fighters, into Syria, supposedly to support the Arab Spring Revolution against Damascus, but in fact to produce American design regime change in Damascus and bring the Damascus government back into cooperation with American plans for the region, particularly the control of oil. Now, that produced the vicious war in Syria, which was reversed finally only by Russia coming to the aid of the legitimate Syrian government, while the United States, of course, was present primarily in terms of the radical Islamists that it supported, and indeed by its own troops finally. Now, something similar was going on in Nicaragua, it seems, where a legitimate local uprising is aided and supported locally and internationally by the United States, and the legitimate, if not admirable, government of Nicaragua is turned into a object of American overthrow. This is not an unrecognized pattern. This is what the U.S. has been doing all over the world for a good long time, and we shouldn't be surprised to see it arise in Central America as well.
Yeah, it is a discordant note. You mentioned the business about the IMF or the World Bank praising Nicaragua, the Ortega government, for the manner in which it's handled it, but for what it's worth, and the purpose of the IMF has usually been to get poor countries into debt, so they have to restructure their government, austerity, and all that to repay those debts. Apparently, I don't know what the bottom of this is, but apparently Nicaragua is able to borrow money, use it for a proper purpose, pay it back, and develop its country. And I guess the World Bank or the IMF or both have been honest enough to say that they've played by those rules. Maybe they haven't tried to. Maybe the IMF hasn't tried to I mean, they've got Nicaragua in a neoliberal context. It's sort of conventional wisdom that in order to survive, that they had to do neoliberal things, certain governmental austerity programs, so on and so forth. So maybe they're just happy enough with them to not want to break their kneecaps the way they do in most notoriously Argentina and Greece. So they're doing okay in that regard. Just one more little note here. I wanted to refer to when Chomsky was originally writing about Nicaragua up to the election that you referred to of Violeta Chamorro in 1990, the headline that the New York Times headline that Chomsky refers to in one of his book chapters or one of his books was "United in Joy," as the response of the Nicaraguan people when Ortega was finally forced into this election and finally thrown out of office. So "United in Joy" was Chomsky's ironic sort of handle on the manner in which the U.S. media covered the conclusion of our decade-long attack on that small and poor country, which gave rise to the whole Iran-Contra scandal and Oliver North and the whole thing.
If we look back just on on recent years, we see that the real accomplishment of the Obama administration was to distract people's attention, cover sin with smooth names, as the scriptures say, make sure that there was no uproar about the U.S. war provocations from Eastern Europe to the South China Sea. There was no upset about the U.S. Fighting 8 wars in Obama's years. He's the first American president to be at war throughout 2 presidential terms, the first. Neither Roosevelt nor Wilson or any of the other 20th century presidents ever was. The talent that the Obama administration displayed was to not keep people upset. People, in this case, meaning the American populace. Not let people get upset about the vast war-making of those years. And the error, if that's the word, of the Trump administration was, first of all, to criticize those wars and attract the attention of the neocons during the campaign and produce this mad campaign of Russiagate and so forth that means to defeat any attempts by the Trump administration to carry out the criticisms of those wars that occurred during the campaign. The result has been remarkably enough, a growth in attention to them. Obama's disappearing act for American depredations around the world could not be carried out by Trump, the master of bluster. And the last case, in some cases, may not be worse than the first, and as far as war-making is concerned. Look at the summits in Helsinki and the summit with North Korea. The result may not be worse, but it's attracted the attention of the American political establishment, which thrives on war, which lives on war, which economic hegemony depends upon the threats of war against Russia and China, and as a result, we have gotten this sort of hysterical reaction. So in a paradoxical way, the Trump administration has opened people's eyes to what was being done by the Obama administration, precisely by, in some cases, not continuing it. And that makes the neocons very angry. The war party, that a coalition of political forces in the United States that wants the wars against Russia and China for primarily economic reasons and wants to continue the competition with Russia and China around the world, those folks are scared to death that Trump might mean what he said.
Yeah. So just to switch gears a little bit here.
Might as well.
Maybe we could find our way back to Norman Finkelstein and what's going on with all that. I'm not sure if I read that article or not, or whether I thought I read it, or whether it was just basically stuff I already heard before.
Right.
But I can't imagine that there's anything that he said that I wouldn't have gotten the idea of previously. But let me just mention a couple of things in passing here, because I think another an already 90-year-old plus person of Jewish Israeli background, and that would be Uri Avneri, who writes regularly for Counterpunch, has been writing some very interesting stuff. I mean, for quite some time, like 60 years, but more recently even, I mean, he seems to be still pretty much at the top of his game at 90 years plus. So that in and of itself seems worth noting in terms of explaining some of the inner workings. He's known all the Israeli leaders since the very start, and he's worked with them, and then opposed to them as a leftist within the Israeli framework, and he has continued to write good stuff, which shows up on Counterpunch every week or two. Also, another person that whose virtues I like to extol on this program, Shir Hever, Hever, who's a young Israeli living in Germany, studying in Germany in Heidelberg, and he's somebody who I think really has a grasp of the inner workings of the Israeli national security state. He's written a book about the privatization of the security state, of the Israeli security state, and its relationship with the American security state, in terms of, as well as in terms of the Americans basically telling Israel, you can produce certain stuff, but you're not going to compete with the American military industrial complex. So don't try, find your little niches, but don't compete with Lockheed Martin. Don't compete with Boeing. We're not going to tolerate that. And that, of course, gets back to our usual comments about whether the tail wags the dog, or not. And so I think I recommend the interviews that Shir Hever did in the last couple of days on the Real News Network with this fellow Mark Steiner, who's been doing some of their work lately. I think it's very, very informative. And I think American Jews, whether they support or don't support Israel, are just beginning, or haven't really gotten a grasp of how Israel has changed. I mean, we have this view of what Israel was, say, from 1948 to 1967. Of course, everything everywhere has changed since 1967, especially since the 1970s and 1980s and neoliberal era. And of course, Israel has changed right along with this. Its internal dynamics, socially, economically, and so forth, have changed radically. Its class structure has changed. Its relation to the Palestinians has changed. Its relation to, obviously, the rest of the Arab and Muslim world have changed. And I think American Jews obviously need to have a better grasp of that, and to get away from this understanding that Israel is this isolated island in the Middle East, and to get over this romantic, however understandable or otherwise, this romantic attachment that American Jews have with Israel in the post-Holocaust era. And that perhaps gets us back to Norman Finkelstein's and Jeremy Corbyn's issues in terms of the British Labour Party. It's surprising to me that you could, in the British context or in this context, we can get away, anybody can feel that they can get away with calling leftists anti-Semites because they question what Israel's relationship is with the Middle East. Well, it's obvious that Israel is an ally of the Saudis now. Look what the Saudis are doing in Yemen. Now, I mean, Israel may not be so directly involved with that, but Israel is part of that alliance that the U.S. is fostering in the oil-rich region.
And it does produce some strange bedfellows. Netanyahu, who's saying this, well, of course, Hitler didn't really mean to exterminate all the Jews.
That's what Netanyahu has said recently, or
yes, just this last week.
Yeah.
I mean,
in what context did he say that? I mean, what was his purpose, and who was he trying to play by saying that?
Well, that's the question, and I haven't got a good answer, but we'll put a note to that on the Facebook page along with
maybe Dr. No can go to work on that.
Yeah, that's right. Well, thanks as usual to Dr. No for a good bit of the material we've been using this evening.
Yeah.
Two final points of other people that we quote with pleasure, who don't usually find their ways into the discussions in mainstream media. The author of Capital in the 21st Century, Piketty, was at MIT this week, of all places, and spoke about what had to be done for inequality, particularly in the United States. He pointed out that while inequality dropped dramatically during the World Wars and the Great Depression, the percent of income going to the top 10% of earners has since the Second World War and the Depression risen steeply almost everywhere. That is, money has been concentrated into fewer and fewer hands throughout the world since the Second World War. The rise has been more dramatic in the United States than in Europe. A second discussion of general principles occurred in a New York Times piece authored by editors of Jacobin, that you mentioned earlier, on the question of constitutionalism. I think this is very worthwhile, not only for the current issues, but in general. In the discussion of Brexit, the best thing I ever read about that discussion, about the question of Britain leaving the European Union, was written by the constitutional scholar Richard Tuck. And the question of constitutionalism and what actually constitutionalism was raised in that, quoting of all people Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who wrote in the 1840s that one had to realize that constitutions were designed to keep elite control in place. We praise the American Constitution as this work of genius. A lot of Americans seem to think it descended from on high as a divine revelation. The American Constitution was actually designed, as its principal historian, James Madison, said, to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. This was not a surprise because, as Marx described, this had been the purpose of constitutionalism from the early 19th century, at least. One could argue that it goes back to Aristotle. But in any case, the question of constitutionalism was raised by these provocative editors at Jacobin in the New York Times again this week. And it may be something we should be talking about when we have American liberals saying, well, it may be time for a military coup in the United States to get this terrible man out of the presidency and put the presidency back into a safe pair of hands like Mrs. Clinton. Constitutionalism may be on the agenda.
Yeah, you know, Carl, after last weekend, after the Red Sox beat the Yankees 4 times,
there we are.
I thought, you know, Boston might think this is as good as it gets. Let's just close up shop and go home. I mean, Chomsky isn't teaching at MIT anymore.
That's right.
So what's the point? I mean, do we need Boston any?
That's an interesting idea.
Anymore? I mean, anyway.
Having lived in Boston for many, many years. Before I came to Champaign and lived in Champaign for many, many years, the question of what Boston is doing and why is an open one.
Yeah, but with that, you know, you reminded me of that with Piketty speaking at MIT. So maybe there's still a reason for Boston to be there, but. Anyway, yeah, I mean, every week, I mean, I read Naked Capitalism, I read other economic blogs, Dean Baker and so forth, and every week, you know, on the one hand, we're reading stories about how the economy is doing now, And, you have to be honest about what the data shows either way. But the plight of the American working class isn't getting better. More people may be working, you can't deny that, but the plight of the American working class isn't in any minimal qualitative way getting any better in terms of its exploitation.
Exactly.
So, that's the key thing. So you look at all this data, and then the data, Piketty has shown, and everybody keeps doing the same data, finding it in different places, and they always find the same thing, and that's that 10% of the people are doing a whole lot better, and especially the 1%, and the next 40% from 50 to 90 is kind of holding its own in the last 30, 40 years, and the bottom 50% has had the bottom fall out of it. And those are the people that are living in cars. Those are the students that are going to food banks. So there isn't any good sort of qualitative news on the sort of class struggle front, and so we have to continue to really talk about that and to talk about what that underlying structure is, and how nothing that's going on, whatever Trump's efforts, random efforts to sort of challenge neoliberal pieties in terms of trade and so forth, in terms of the TPP and NAFTA. Yes, the TPP was a bad deal. Trump vetoed it. And NAFTA is, I'm not sure what the status of that is now, but it isn't at all clear, of course, that neither of those things, or whatever he's doing regarding tariffs. And I kind of enjoy all the fuss about tariffs. I kind of enjoy all the people that get upset by that. Maybe I'm not being fair to the people that are actually being hurt by these things, but Trump is stirring things up in that regard. He just doesn't have a plan for things getting any better in terms of how all that plays out.
We've been talking for a while about the extent to which left-right distinctions, which are a commonplace of political discussion in the U.S. and abroad, are not only inadequate to describe contemporary politics, they're also obviously manipulated by various sides. When we have people producing the Russiagate nonsense in this country, saying that what we're dealing with here is America's subversion by communism, and we're hearing that exactly from people in the United States right now, without noticing that there hasn't been a communist state in Russia for 30 years. This is very strange, but what we're talking about finally in American politics is what seems to me to be far better called populism. That is, the objection of the populace at large to control by elites. And this takes various forms, but trying to divvy them up into left and right distinctions seems not to work very well.
Okay. Just, one thing, it's clear that we have to understand what globalization is, how it has worked, how it has always worked in capitalism for 400 or 500 years, that it's nothing new. But I also ran across an article, I can't recall exactly the source of this, I think it was on Naked Capitalism, but it referred to the idea, it gave some credence to the idea that, yes, we can think about our national economy, our state-based economy, in terms of self-sufficiency in certain ways, in certain areas, whether our own country or respect for other countries. The article referred to the probably forgotten theorist E.F. Schumacher.
No.
And I don't know, I don't know what you ever had to do with E.F. Schumacher, but I thought maybe we need to look back at what E.F. Schumacher was saying about a small, what was it, a small planet or whatever. Anyway, but because it's easy for people on the left to kind of sort of in realist terms dismiss the idea that we can have national economies, so as not to join all these right-wing populists in quote-unquote right-wing populists and saying, well, can't we do this ourselves? And it's a complicated thing, but there is room for that debate. for that discourse.
You've been watching News from Neptune for Friday, August 10th, 2018. This has been I Have a Little List edition of News from Neptune. Our program is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scollery. Our thanks for research to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson. No's notes are found on the Facebook page for News from Neptune, along with links to some of the other articles and discussions that we've mentioned tonight. Now, this is Carl Estabrook with David Green saying, Inshallah, we will be back next week to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere from The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.